Hello, I'm Hans Wiersma, a Lutheran pastor. Welcome to a conversation with Ted Kober, President of Ambassadors for Reconciliation. Who are you and what do you do?
I'm a layman, and through some experiences that I had in my life, I was drawn through some conflicts to the ministry of peacemaking. And since that time, I've grown up in peacemaking and developed it. And at Ambassadors of Reconciliation, our vision is to help Lutherans understand how they can be living, proclaiming, and cultivating lifestyles of reconciliation.
When you talk about reconciliation, then you assume conflict, and you said that you're a layperson, a businessman originally. Maybe this is the time to tell the story about how you got hooked into this ministry.
I was administering my father's estate, which was a very complex estate involving many different businesses and entities. And I had leased a large commercial property to a man who, when we first met, I learned he was a Christian. And at first we had very warm feelings toward each other because of our common faith. But as we began to work with one another and I leased the property to him, he defaulted on the lease. He failed to make lease payments. So I went and talked to him several times, and he said cash flow was tight and he was working on things. But over a matter of weeks and months, he still didn't pay any rent. Now, I was responsible as personal representative of the estate to many creditors, more than 60 of them, including government agencies such as the IRS. And they were expecting me to liquidate these properties or make them productive. So my attorney said, you need to have this man removed from the property, but don't worry, it'll be a quick, easy deal. You have a 30-page signed lease, he's defaulted on it. It shouldn't last long at all. Well, it took 60 days to get the court date. And then the hearing lasted for a full day. And then the judge took 6 months before he issued his decision. In the meantime, this other man stayed in the property, collected rent from subtenants, ran his business, but didn't pay any rent. Finally, the judge awarded in the estate's favor, giving us a judgment against him and saying he had to leave. But he wouldn't leave the property. So I had to go back to the judge and get a sheriff's order. And on October 25th of that year, I went with an army of sheriffs, locksmiths, and attorneys to physically remove that man and his employees, 5 other subtenants and their employees, and more than 200 storage customers from this property. For although they had paid rent to this man, the estate had not received anything, and we had to start all over. Well, people were so angry because some of them had paid rent up to 2 years in advance that the sheriff wouldn't leave the property until I had an armed guard to protect the property and until my home phone number had been changed to an unlisted number. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, and I had to meet with these 200+ angry people, explaining what had happened and renegotiating new leases with them. And in the middle of that, I got a summons. This other man was now taking me to court, claiming that I had created a hardship for him by taking away his business, and that's why he couldn't pay rent. And shortly after I received the summons, I received a phone call from Ken Sandy, president of Peacemaker Ministries. Ken said, "Ted, I understand that you and this other man are in a lawsuit." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "This other man is a Christian, and I know you by reputation to be a Christian, and he suggested that you resolve this through Christian mediation." What would you have said to Ken? I said, "Ken," I said, "you don't understand. This conflict is not between me and this other man, but between this other man and the estate. And I'm only a fiduciary representing the interests of some 60 creditors besides the beneficiaries, and they're not going to appreciate me subjecting this process to some Christian mediation, especially when we're legally in the right. Moreover, this other man doesn't even act like a Christian. Thanks for calling," and I hung up on him. So we ended up going to court. This time, the judge awarded in the other man's favor. He said, "You have to give him the property back." My security guard brought me the notice at 10:30 at night, and I cried out, "Why? Why, God?" I was so angry at God over the injustice of this whole thing, and I was an angry man. But part of the judge's order said that he had to pay the back rent within 10 days if he could get possession, and he failed to do that. So I won that round by default. But then I got another summons. We were going to court a third time, and I began to count the costs. You see, the estate had spent $100,000 so far in legal and administrative fees, and we still weren't done fighting. And so not because of biblical reasons, but what I like to call fiscal responsibility reasons, I picked up the phone and I called Ken Sandy and I said, can we talk about Christian mediation? Ken invited me to his office and he opened the scriptures to me and read scriptures that I'd heard before but never thought about applying to a business dispute. And now I became convicted through God's word that there was a different way of dealing with a Christian brother. And so we went to mediation. And in 2 weekend sessions, we not only resolved the fighting in the legal issues, but we reconciled as Christian brothers. And that turned my life upside down, where I saw a new way to apply my faith, even in a business lawsuit, that eventually drew me into this ministry that we call peacemaking.
That is quite a story. And I imagine at the time it was a wake-up call to you personally. You know, I've been operating as a Christian businessman in one way, and yet the gospel gives me some tools to be a Christian businessman in a way that gets some results.
You know, we become quite proficient at segmenting our life. And we say, here's my faith life, here's my family life, here's my work life, here's my social life. But from God's perspective, all of life comes under our relationship to Him. And that's what I was failing to do. I had segmented my life in so many different categories that I wasn't even aware that I wasn't living my faith in my business life, let alone my family or social areas.